Hi there, Alex here at mixinglessons.com. In this video, we're going to talk about the process of either using additive EQ in your mixes or subtractive EQ in your mixes. So additive EQ would refer to the process of using an EQ plugin to turn frequencies up, whereas subtractive EQ would refer to the process of using an equalizer to turn frequencies down. And we'll talk about some of the implications of these two different approaches and some of the things to take into account so that you can decide which is the better approach to take when you're mixing. Before we dive in, if you're somebody who records and mixes music, then I've got 3 free PDF guides that I think you'll find really useful to have on hand in your home studio. I've got a free EQ cheat sheet, a compression cheat sheet, and a vocal recording guide. And you can get all 3 by heading over to mixinglessons.com/free-downloads. Okay, so as I mentioned, when we refer to additive EQ, we're talking about turning frequencies up using an EQ plugin. And when we talk about subtractive EQ, we're referring to turning frequencies down using an EQ plugin. Now, this is one of those topics where people seem to have quite strong opinions sometimes. You'll sometimes hear it argued that subtractive EQ is superior to additive EQ. In reality, I've never met any mix engineer who I think creates really great mixes who favors additive or subtractive EQ. All of the people I know who create really good sounding mixes use both. Sometimes they'll turn frequencies up, sometimes they'll turn frequencies down. And I certainly don't see either one as being better than the other. It's just two different tools that you have to EQ music. So to me, both approaches are entirely valid, but there are times when one approach might be a little bit more optimal than the other. Now, in some instances, which route you should take, whether you should turn some frequencies up or turn some frequencies down, will be really obvious. Let's say, for example, you've got a vocal track with some plosives. Plosives are those little bursts of air that you get with letters like B and P, which can create a bit of a popping sound in the low end. Generally, we would try to resolve that by turning those frequencies down. So we would try to bring that under control by using subtractive EQ. Equally, there will be times when it just makes sense to make the track sound a certain way by turning some frequencies up. But there are occasions where the result that you want to achieve can be reached by either using subtractive EQ or additive EQ. And sometimes the best route to take requires a little bit of consideration, and sometimes the best route to take isn't necessarily the obvious choice. Let's say, for example, you want to make a track sound brighter. You could generally reach this point via 2 methods. You could either turn up the high end, or you could often turn down the low end. Let's just have a little look at that in action. So you can hear there that by turning up the high end, the track gets brighter. But if we reset that, let's see what happens if we, instead of turning up the high end, turn down the low end. By turning down some of that low end, the result again is that overall the track sounds a bit brighter. And so there are 2 different approaches to achieving a similar result. And so how do you decide which option to go with and which route would be the better one to take? Well, I think there are 2 questions that it's useful to ask yourself, which will kind of guide you on which route to take. The first question is, why do I feel that I need to make the change that I'm trying to make? So let's stick with the example of making a track brighter. If you feel that you need to make a track brighter, it can be useful to ask yourself, why do I feel that I need to make this track brighter? If the answer to that question is because the track doesn't have enough high end in it, then turning up the high end is probably the correct thing to do. But if, when you listen to the track, you think to yourself, why do I feel that this needs to be brighter? And you think it needs to be brighter because there's too much low end or low mid information, then you're probably better using subtractive EQ on the low end and the low mids, rather than using additive EQ on the high end. Now you might think, well, why does that matter? If either method will make the track sound brighter, and that's what we're aiming for, then why does it matter which route you take? Well, if you've got a lot of tracks in your mix and they all have quite a lot of low end or low mid information, then overall your mix could sound quite muddy and quite boomy, and it could be lacking in clarity. And so if you were to try and resolve that by turning up the high end of different tracks, you can end up with a mix which is simultaneously boomy and muddy, but also quite harsh and quite brittle because you've turned up lots of the high end because you didn't feel that the mix had enough presence or clarity, that you felt that it was too boomy and muddy. But by trying to resolve that by adding high end, the mix has now become harsh because there's too much high end, and you also haven't actually resolved the original issue, which was that there was too much low end. That was what was making things sound muddy. So in that instance, rather than using additive EQ in the high end, it would have been better to use subtractive EQ in the low end and in the low mids. So that's the first question to ask. Why is it that I feel that I need to make this change to the frequencies of this track? And that will often guide you on whether additive or subtractive EQ is going to be the best route to take. And then the second question that I think that it's useful to ask yourself is, what is the broader consequence of using either additive or subtractive EQ? So if we stick with the idea of making a track brighter, what is the consequence of turning up that track's high end? For example, does turning up the high end on that track mean that that track then starts to compete with another track for that high end, for that area of the frequency spectrum? And in which case, would it potentially be better making that track brighter by turning down the low end? Or conversely, what's the broader consequence to turning down the low end? You might have noticed when we turned the low end down on this drum track, the track felt a little bit more thin and a little bit more hollow. So does the track suffer in any way by you using subtractive EQ, by taking some frequencies away? Or does the whole mix sound a little bit more thin and a little bit more hollow by you taking away the low end of certain instruments? So these are two questions that I think it can be really useful to keep in mind. Now, a lot of the time when we're mixing, we kind of do things a little bit more instinctively. So a lot of the time you will just either use additive or subtractive EQ and you won't even think about it. The best route to take will sort of be obvious to you. But sometimes it's useful to just pause and ask yourself these two questions, particularly if you're ever running into a bit of an issue with your EQ and you're struggling to make things sound the way you want them to. It's useful to think to yourself, why is it that I feel that I need to make this change? And what is the broader consequence of using additive EQ versus using subtractive EQ? Like I say, to my mind, both routes are completely valid. It's just sometimes a case of having a bit of a think as to which one is going to be the best route to take in different situations. So I hope you find that useful. Don't forget to head over to mixinglessons.com/free-downloads for that free EQ cheat sheet, that free compression cheat sheet, and that free vocal recording guide. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.